One of the largest independent car dealerships in the country has officially closed and filed for bankruptcy, and what this means for the overall car market as a whole, well, it's not good. Last week, it was announced that Tricolor, once the 7th largest used car dealer in the country, had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and the company would be moving forward with a liquidation sale from here. Now, Tricolor wasn't your stereotypical franchise dealership like Chevy, Toyota, or Ford. They were an independent dealership focusing on selling cars and making loans to low-income individuals and undocumented immigrants. And the fallout from this bankruptcy filing is going to be so severe that large banks are set to lose hundreds of millions of dollars, and there are already some early claims of fraud. But we'll get back to that. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Tricolor is a dealership that specializes in low credit, low income borrowers, as well as undocumented immigrants that may not be able to get a loan with a more traditional lender through a more traditional dealership. And I think that this is an important thing to point out, because obviously ICE raids and deportations are something that are heavily discussed and things that are actively happening throughout the country. And I don't want to turn this video into a discussions of ICE or deportations because candidly, I don't think anybody watching this video wants to talk about that here. But I do think it's important to talk about some of the different impacts of immigration crackdowns, especially in the way in which they've been happening, and especially when it impacts the context of the car market, which is what this channel is about. You see, you don't need a social security number or be documented to get a car loan, and it's also not illegal to give a car loan to an undocumented person. But according to news reports from sources like Bloomberg, as deportations have escalated and increased, not only have a larger percentage of people been deported that have outstanding car loans, with lenders like Tricolor who then leave the country, they don't end up paying their car loan, obviously, because they've been deported, and then their car loan is now kind of hanging in the air and it eventually goes into default. But it's also causing people who may be at risk of falling behind on their car loan not reaching out for assistance for fear of being deported. These are people that don't want to reach out to a lender, they don't want to seek guidance for fear of being deported, and as a result, they are just letting their loans go into default. So deportations are absolutely having an impact here, and it's impacting businesses like Tricolor who have historically gone after and targeted immigrants as customers. But immigrants aren't the only segment of customers that have caused the dominoes to fall for Tricolor, because just generally low income and low credit borrowers have as well. We talked about this a lot on my channel, specifically in the context of auto asset-backed securities as well as Carvana, Santander, but lending money out to low credit or low income borrowers for the purpose of those people buying something like a car, this is a big business, but it's also one that has become more and more risky over the years. You see, in the car lending space, there are multiple categories of borrowers, just like we have multiple categories of credit scores. You have your prime borrowers. These are people with higher credit scores, generally have higher income, and while they are less lucrative from a lending perspective, they are also much safer because someone with a high credit score is less likely to not pay that. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the categories of subprime or deep subprime. And these are borrowers that have poor credit and generally are lower income, and they have a much higher likelihood to not pay. And thus, the loan associated with the subprime or deep subprime borrower is significantly more risky because it has a higher default rate. It is also significantly more lucrative because of the fact that it has a high interest rate associated with it. And Tricolor as a business model really focused on the latter, the subprime and deep subprime borrower. The point is, Tricolor focused on subprime lending, but subprime lending isn't something that only Tricolor participates in, nor is it anything new. In fact, a little event called the mortgage crisis of 2008 was caused by them.
Nearly 8% of borrowers in the subprime category, those are the higher risk loans to often lower income borrowers, have fallen 3 months behind in their payments or face foreclosure. But many borrowers are also starting to fall behind in the better loan categories.
You may have heard of it. And in recent years, subprime lending had taken a bit of a dive as lending standards has tightened a bit as of late. But according to TransUnion, subprime loans have been growing in recent quarters. But as a result, so has their default rate. So more and more people who fall into this borrowing category just simply aren't paying off their loans. The average interest rate as of last month for a subprime borrower is 16% for a new car and 22% for a used car. This is more than twice the rate the average credit score borrower would pay. This is a credit card level interest rate charged specifically on used cars that are depreciating every single day that they're on the road. And it makes it extremely difficult for these borrowers to pay them back or get out of the loan that they're in. And despite subprime loans increasing in popularity over the last couple of quarters, it doesn't mean that these loans are any safer from a repayment perspective compared to where they once were. In fact, auto loan delinquencies are continuing to rise past 2009 levels, and according to data from earlier this year, subprime auto loan delinquencies are sitting at about 6.5%, which is the highest level that we've seen. In fact, you can see here this graph goes back to 1992, which is longer than I've been alive, which is not a good look. Now, for the fraud claims, which adds an entirely new dramatic level to the story, now that has to do with Tricolor asset-backed securities. Now, we talked about this in the context of Carvana, but in the world of car loans, many car dealerships operate not only as a vehicle to sell cars, but also as one to originate car loans. How it works in super simplistic terms is we have the dealership, in this case it would be Tricolor. They sell the car and they give the buyer of that vehicle a loan. They then do this a bunch of times and eventually they have a ton of money lent out to a ton of different borrowers, which can add up to hundreds of millions of dollars. And what businesses like Tricolor do, but Carvana also does this, is instead of holding on to all of that debt and all of those loans, which can not only be a risky move, but it can also hurt liquidity and cash flow, they will then clump together a bunch of different loans and they will sell it in the form of an asset-backed security to something like a bank. And then these bigger banks will buy this asset-backed security in the form of an investment. And these asset-backed securities are divided into categories or tranches based off of risk factor. And in the case of Tricolor, Barclays, Fifth Third Bancorp, and JP Morgan were all investors of these securities and all stand to lose hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of this bankruptcy. In fact, Bloomberg reports that JP Morgan and Barclays purchased a $217 million bundle of Tricolor loans as recently as June. And some of these banks are actually going as far as to accuse Tricolor of fraud. And according to reports, Fifth Third said they had discovered alleged external fraudulent activity related to a $200 million asset-backed loan held by Irving, Texas-based Tricolor, with the CEO of Fifth Third Bancorp saying this: "Based on our ongoing review, it appears there is a significant fraud in the collateral file that was used to support the borrowing base in all of their warehouse facilities, as well as the audited financial statements of the company." Now, this is interesting and obviously not good news for Tricolor, these banks, or these customers. And as of now, this is really all we know about this fraudulent situation, but I will definitely keep you guys up to date as we learn more information. But the bottom line is, whenever it comes to the Tricolor bankruptcy, this is something that we have been seeing periodically over the last couple of years, and I personally expect that we will continue to see it. I've talked about this and belabored this point on my channel over and over and over again, but the reality is the American debt situation has simply gotten out of control, specifically when it comes to things like bad debt, like credit cards, revolving debt, and car loans, which are all categories of debt which have absolutely skyrocketed over the last couple of years. And I've been predicting for a long time that I think that this debt situation is eventually going to come to a head. And situations like Tricolor is ultimately what happens whenever debt gets out of control. Like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it. So make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video.